The Statue of Liberty was supposed to be a symbol of welcome and hope to immigrants in America, many of whom had left their home country in search for a better life in the United States. But this came at a time when this golden door was not open to all. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was passed 4 years prior to the opening of the Statue of Liberty, barring the immigration of all Chinese laborers and setting a precedent as the first major law restricting American immigration.
The Chinese Exclusion Act is the first and only time the United States has said a specific group cannot come into this country.
The act was passed on May 6, 1882. Although the law was initially passed to only last for 10 years, further acts were later passed to prolong the act and eventually make it permanent, until it was repealed by the Magnuson Act in 1943. During the time in which the act was in effect, all Chinese laborers were barred from immigrating to the U.S. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the result of years of anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States. The strong desire to protect and stand up for the mid to late 19th century definition of the American identity, which was heavily founded upon nativism and Eurocentrism, led to the ratification of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which in turn reinforced such ideas. Race and ethnicity strongly defined the American identity of the late 1800s, when a strong attitude of nativism laid a foundation for the anti-Chinese sentiment before the Exclusion Act. With roots back to anti-Catholic fear of American colonialism, nativists, who ironically referred to themselves as Native Americans, held an intense opposition to the internal minority on the ground of its foreign connections.
There was a period of time when I think Americans came to regard themselves, or came to regard the notion of Americanism as nativist, nationalistic, Christian, European, white, fill in all those things.
From this viewpoint, the United States was split into old and new immigrants. These old immigrants were typically from Western European countries. New immigrants were seen as a threat to the traditional American society and culture defined through the lens of a Western European America. Many ethnic groups bore the brunt of this sentiment.
In the 1880s, Jews are being pushed out of Russia because of pogroms. They're coming to the United States, and it's kind of like, oh my God, the Jews are coming. Or Italians are starving in southern Italy, and all of a sudden it's, oh my God, the Catholics are upon us. Or in the 1840s, it's the arrival of the Irish. So there's always someone sort of new. And sometimes the newness and the numbers petrify the people who are already here, especially if the arrivals occur in insecure times.
When the 1830s and 40s saw an increase in Irish and German Catholic immigrants, Protestantism and anti-Catholicism rose as a direct result. Subsequently, the American Party, also known as the Know-Nothing Party, rose to political prominence in the 1840s. Members of this party were overwhelmingly Protestant, middle to working class Americans who feared losing their jobs to immigrants. Unsurprisingly, one of the core principles of the American Party was its strong opposition to immigration. Before it was dissolved in 1860, laws were passed that targeted and penalized immigrants, including a mandated literacy test for Irish voters. Before the Chinese Exclusion Act, many Chinese, who often immigrated to escape environmental disaster and violent political upheaval, were attracted to the economic promises of the United States. The California Gold Rush and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad provided an opportunity for Chinese immigrants to gain wealth. Unsurprisingly, intense anti-Chinese sentiment followed their immigration. Americans were greatly concerned with the apparent non-Americanness of Chinese immigrants who often immigrated to America to send money back home.
But this is also a moment where nativist ideas, also expressed in terms of white supremacy, begin to come in. And you have a number of politicians, I think the guy's name is Miller, in California, and he's a senator. And what he wants to do is sort of consolidate. He wants to make a name for himself, because all of this has to do with making a name for yourself and garnering power. But what he wants to do is sort of harness these prejudices and put them on a national scale. So the Chinese Exclusion Act begins to provide that apparatus.
American politician John Bigler, in his 1852 address to the California State Legislature, argued that Chinese do not seek our land as the asylum for the oppressed of all nations, and measures must be adopted to check this tide of Asiatic immigration and prevent the exploitation by them of the precious metals which they dig up from our soil without charge, and without assuming any of the obligations imposed upon citizens. Many like Bigler felt like the integrity of America was being compromised and felt a need to safeguard America for who they believed deserved to remain in the States. Even before the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were other acts passed targeting the Chinese immigrants in America, such as the 1855 Act to discourage the immigration to the state of persons who cannot become citizens thereof. This act and others like it were some of the ways that Californians were standing up for their notion of American identity. While the anti-Chinese sentiment originated in the West Coast, California specifically, after Chinese laborers in Massachusetts were used as strikebreakers in 1870, it became a national phenomenon. Despite opposition to the influx of Chinese immigrants in the United States, Chinese unskilled laborers were widely used because they worked for far smaller wages than their white counterparts, and these Chinese workers became a crucial component in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. As many as 8,000 to 10,000 Chinese men worked for the Central Pacific Railroad Company, many of whom worked in perilous conditions.
They're looking at the Chinese and saying, you've taken my job. You've taken jobs from white Americans.
The arrival of Chinese workers in the railroad industry was viewed as detrimental to American society and economy, and many Americans felt the need to stand up to this potential harm. A fierce advocate for the anti-Chinese movement, Dennis Kearney promoted popular ideas of ethnic alienation towards the Chinese.
Dennis Kearney, for instance, who was such an opponent of the Chinese, wasn't born in the United States. He was an Irish immigrant.
He helped form the Working Men's Party of California in the late 1870s, which fought and stood up for workers' rights in the U.S. While it was originally formed to discuss issues relating to labor, Kearney shifted the direction of the conversation to focus specifically on the Chinese. On July 23, 1877, supporters of the Working Men's Party started a riot against the Chinese in San Francisco. On the first night, they attacked Chinese laundry businesses. On the second night, a lumberyard near the docks that was responsible for the transportation of a large number of Chinese immigrants was set on fire. Several men were killed as a result. In defense of the anti-Chinese sentiment and the measures taken to stand up against Chinese immigration, Kearney made a statement saying, "I made up my mind if our civilization, California civilization, was to continue, Chinese immigration must be stopped." Kearney continued his efforts to raise the issue of Chinese immigration to people's attention, even campaigning nationally, and ultimately saw the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. All of the measures the American people and European immigrants took to stand up for what they thought were their rights accumulated with the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers, but allowed Chinese students, teachers, merchants, and tourists to enter the U.S. The intense opposition to the Chinese in America did not stop with the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act. In many states, there were anti-Chinese massacres, riots, and forcible expulsions. On September of 1885, more than 600 Chinese employed at the Rock Springs coal mine refused to go on strike, so the white workers retaliated by burning the shacks of the Chinese workers in the Rock Springs massacre. 28 were killed and 15 were wounded. However, during this turbulent time, European immigration was still being actively encouraged. Many other acts were passed later on as a continuation of the nativist and anti-Chinese movement.
So 1882, those provisions in that act go until 1892. But then they get revived in the Geary Act. So sort of every 10 years, you have a revisiting of, can we let Asians into America? Can we let Chinese into America? And each year, they take away something else.
The Cable Act denied citizenship for Americans who married aliens ineligible for citizenship, and the Johnson-Reed Act classified immigrants based off of their race and nationality, giving preferential treatment to immigrants from Northern and Western Europe.
And again, this brings us to today, where we talk about building a wall to keep the Mexicans out, or this concern, this fear over Muslims coming into this country, and our fears that they are radical Islamists that are going to come and terrorize our country. Those all those sort of ideas, people taking our jobs, like the Mexicans taking our jobs, and Muslims coming in and potentially being terrorists. Those fears and concerns date back to the Chinese Exclusion Act.
The Chinese Exclusion Act reflected a period of intense anti-Chinese racism and nativism in American history when white Americans fought to stand up and protect what they thought was their America.